Montana Territory, 1885. The distant sound of hoofbeats stirred the prairie dust as dawn broke over the rolling hills of the Diamond P Ranch. Dewitt Palmer stood at the edge of his property, watching the sun climb over the eastern ridge, painting the Montana sky in strokes of amber and gold. At 25, he'd already carved out his piece of the frontier, but the cost had been steep. 3 years since Anna's passing in childbirth, and the ranch house still echoed with emptiness. Dewitt adjusted his weathered Stetson, running a hand through his sandy brown hair. His face, handsome despite the weight of responsibility etched upon it, remained set in the stoic expression he'd perfected since burying his wife and infant son. The light stubble on his jaw caught the morning light as he surveyed his land. A man needs nothing but his land and his cattle, he murmured to himself, a mantra he'd repeated countless times since the graves were dug. Attachments only leave you with fresh dirt to shovel. The Diamond P was modest but growing. 40 head of cattle, a sturdy main house, a barn, and a bunkhouse for the 2 hired hands who helped during busy seasons. Dewitt had built it all with his own 2 hands, determined to prove that a man could carve civilization from wilderness through sheer force of will. He'd convinced himself that loneliness was simply the price of frontier success. From the ridge, he could see Joey, his ranch hand, approaching on horseback, kicking up dust that caught the morning light. Something about the urgency in the horse's gait told Dewitt this wasn't a routine morning check. "Boss," Joey called, bringing his mount to a halt. "Stage is coming through town today. Got a wire from Billings. Your cousin sent someone. Says they'll be arriving on the noon stage." Dewitt frowned. "I didn't ask Thomas to send anyone." "Well, they're coming all the same. Woman, from what I gathered. Something about helping around the place." A flicker of irritation crossed DeWitt's face. His cousin meant well, but the last thing he needed was some city woman underfoot, asking questions, stirring up dust in corners he'd carefully swept clean of memories. "We manage fine," he said flatly. Joey shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Might be nice to have proper meals again. Been living on beans and hardtack so long I'm starting to dream of biscuits." DeWitt shot him a look that ended the conversation. "North pasture needs checking. Thought I heard wolves last night." As Joey rode off, DeWitt gazed back at the ranch house. It had been built for a family, 3 bedrooms, a generous kitchen, a parlor with bookshelves Anna had insisted on. Now it stood as a monument to failed dreams, to the harsh reality that the frontier gave and took with equal measure and no warning. No room for softness out here, he reminded himself as he mounted his horse. Just survival. But even as he spoke the words, a small voice, one he tried desperately to silence, whispered that survival alone was a cold companion on long winter nights. The noon stage arrived in a cloud of dust and commotion, the 6-horse team pulling to a stop outside Dawson's General Store with practiced precision. DeWitt leaned against a hitching post, arms crossed over his chest, his expression carefully neutral despite his inner turmoil. He'd come to town reluctantly, determined to send whoever Thomas had dispatched right back east on tomorrow's stage. The door swung open, and the driver helped the young woman descend. DeWitt felt something unfamiliar stir within him as she stepped onto Montana soil. She couldn't have been more than 22, with chestnut brown hair swept up beneath a practical bonnet, tendrils escaping to frame a face that seemed too delicate for frontier life. Her traveling dress, though dusty from the journey, was a rich blue that matched the vast Montana sky above them. Tessa Kendrick took a deep breath of the mountain air, adjusting her small valise as she surveyed the town with curious hazel eyes. 3 weeks of travel had left her exhausted but determined. When Thomas Palmer had offered her the position as housekeeper for his widowed cousin in Montana, she'd seen it as the fresh start she desperately needed after the scandal in Boston. Her gaze fell on the tall figure watching her from the hitching post. Even from a distance, she could see the wariness in his stance. This had to be Dewitt Palmer, younger than she'd expected, with broad shoulders beneath a work-worn shirt and eyes that seemed to evaluate and dismiss her in a single glance. "Mr. Palmer," she called, approaching with measured steps, conscious of how the townspeople watched this encounter with undisguised interest. "I'm Tessa Kendrick. Your cousin Thomas arranged. I know who you are." DeWitt interrupted, his voice low and controlled. "There's been a misunderstanding. I didn't ask for help." Tessa faltered but lifted her chin. "Perhaps not directly, sir. But Thomas was concerned when he received your last letter. He thought, Thomas thinks too much. Dewitt cut in again. The stage leaves tomorrow. You can stay at the boarding house tonight. I've traveled nearly 2,000 miles, Mr. Palmer, Tessa said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. I've left everything behind. I was hired to cook and keep house, and I intend to fulfill that obligation. To whom? I made no such arrangement. A moment of silence stretched between them as the townsfolk pretended not to listen. I have a contract, she said finally, opening her valise to produce a folded document. 6 months of service in exchange for passage west and a small stipend. It bears your cousin's signature as your representative. Dewitt took the paper reluctantly, his jaw tightening as he read. This isn't legally binding. Perhaps not in court, Tessa agreed. But I believe a gentleman's word still counts for something, even in the territories. Does your family's honor mean so little? Something dangerous flashed in his eyes, and Tessa wondered if she'd pushed too far. But she had nowhere else to go, no money to return east, and secrets nipping at her heels like hungry wolves. 3 months, he said finally, folding the contract and handing it back. Then we reassess. My ranch isn't a charity, Miss Kendrick. You'll work for your keep. Relief flooded through her, though she kept her expression composed. I expect nothing less, Mr. Palmer. The ride to the Diamond P stretched in awkward silence. Tessa perched on the wagon seat beside Dewitt, acutely aware of the rigid way he held himself, as if ensuring not even their sleeves brushed. The vast landscape unfolded before them, rolling grasslands dotted with pines, distant mountains standing sentinel against the endless sky. It's beautiful, she ventured, hoping to break the tension. It's hard, he corrected without looking at her. Beautiful doesn't fill your belly when winter comes. Surely there's room for both, she said quietly. Hard and beautiful, existing together. Dewitt's hands tightened on the reins. You won't last the month, he said, but there was less conviction in his voice now. City women never do. Tessa looked down at her hands, calloused in ways he couldn't see. Then I suppose I'll have to prove you wrong, Mr. Palmer. The ranch appeared on the horizon, and Tessa felt her breath catch. Despite its modest size, there was something proud about the way it stood against the wilderness, a declaration of human perseverance. The main house was larger than she'd expected, painted white with green shutters, a wide porch wrapping around the front. It's lovely, she said sincerely. Dewitt's expression softened almost imperceptibly as he gazed at his home. Anna chose the colors, he said, then immediately stiffened, as if he hadn't meant to share that detail. The name hung in the air between them. Tessa knew from Thomas that Anna had been Dewitt's wife, lost in childbirth 3 years prior. The pain in Dewitt's voice told her that 3 years might as well have been 3 days. I'm sorry for your loss, she said simply. Don't, he replied, his voice rough. Don't pretend to understand. As they pulled up to the house, Tessa noted the untended flower beds, the porch that needed sweeping, the windows dulled with grime. This was a home maintained for function, not comfort, a place where a man existed rather than lived. Joey and another ranch hand emerged from the barn, eyeing Tessa with undisguised curiosity. Boys, this is Miss Kendrick, Dewitt said briskly. She'll be cooking and keeping house. For 3 months, he added pointedly. Ma'am. They both touched the brims of their hats, and Tessa didn't miss the glance they exchanged, a look that contained both relief and speculation. I'll show you to your room, Dewitt said, lifting her trunk with ease. The kitchen's well stocked. Supper's at 6. He led her through the front door, and Tessa fought to keep her expression neutral as she took in the state of the house. It wasn't dirty so much as neglected, a home that had been maintained at the minimum level required for survival, with no thought to comfort or beauty. Dust lay thick on picture frames turned face down, and the parlor looked as if it hadn't been used in years. The bedroom he showed her to was small, but had a window overlooking the eastern hills. A simple bed, dresser, and washstand furnished the space. It was meant to be a nursery, Dewitt said, his voice flat as he set down her trunk. Never got used. The implication hung heavy in the air. This room had been prepared for a child who never lived to see it. Thank you, Tessa said softly. I'll make it comfortable. Dewitt paused at the door, seeming to struggle with something. Finally, he said, dinner's at 6, and left her alone. Tessa sat on the edge of the bed, listening to his footsteps retreat down the hall, followed by the sound of the front door closing firmly. Through her window, she watched him stride toward the barn, his shoulders set in a rigid line. "Well, Tessa," she murmured to herself, "you wanted a new beginning. Here it is." She unpacked quickly, hanging her few dresses in the small wardrobe, placing her mother's hairbrush on the dresser, and tucking the newspaper clipping about the Boston scandal deep into her diary. Her fingers lingered on the headline, "Prominent Family Daughter Disgraced." With a deep breath, she tucked the diary under her mattress. That life was behind her now. Here, she was just Tessa Kendrick, housekeeper and cook. Here, she could start again. The kitchen proved to be better equipped than she'd feared, though the pantry held little beyond beans, flour, coffee, and salt pork. Still, she managed to create a respectable meal of biscuits, gravy, and stewed apples by 6 o'clock. When the men filed in for dinner, they stopped short at the sight of the properly set table. Dewitt's eyes widened slightly, taking in the pressed tablecloth she'd found in a drawer and the wildflowers she'd arranged in a mason jar. "Sit, please," she invited, ignoring their surprise. The meal passed in relative silence, broken only by Joey's enthusiastic compliments on the biscuits. Dewitt ate methodically, his eyes fixed on his plate. When he finished, he looked up at her for the first time since they'd arrived at the ranch. "It was good," he said, the words seeming to cost him considerable effort. "Thank you." Something about the simple acknowledgement touched Tessa more deeply than effusive praise would have. This was a man who had forgotten how to accept comfort, who viewed it as weakness rather than necessity. "You're welcome, Mr. Palmer," she replied. "Tomorrow I thought I might tackle the parlor, if that's agreeable to you." A shadow crossed his face. "The parlor's fine as it is. With respect, sir, it hasn't been dusted in months." "Then leave it be for a few more," he said sharply, rising from the table. "Some things are best left undisturbed." As he walked out, Tessa exchanged a glance with Joey. It was Anna's favorite room, the ranch hand explained quietly. She used to read there every evening. "He hasn't set foot in it since the funeral." Tessa nodded, understanding dawning. This wasn't just a house that needed cleaning. It was a mausoleum of memory, each undisturbed corner a shrine to what had been lost. That night, as she prepared for bed, Tessa heard movement on the porch. Peering through her window, she saw Dewitt sitting alone in a rocking chair, staring out at the vast expanse of stars. The rigid line of his shoulders had softened, and in the moonlight, she could see the profound loneliness etched into his profile. For the first time, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake coming here. She hadn't just intruded on a bachelor's solitary existence. She'd stepped into the raw wound of a man who'd lost everything that mattered to him. But as she watched him rock slowly in the silver light, she felt something stir within her, a recognition of the pain they both carried, though from different causes. Perhaps that was why Thomas had sent her here, not just to cook and clean, but because broken people sometimes recognize something in each other that the whole world missed. Over the next 3 weeks, Tessa established a careful routine. She rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, spent mornings cleaning one room at a time, tended to laundry, and prepared hearty meals that slowly coaxed color back into DeWitt's weather-tanned face. She respected his boundaries, avoiding the parlor as requested, though she couldn't help noticing how his eyes sometimes lingered on the closed door when he passed it. Instead, she focused on bringing life back to the rest of the house, scouring the kitchen until copper pots gleamed, washing windows until sunlight poured unfiltered into dusty corners, airing bedding that had grown stale with disuse. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. Fresh-cut wildflowers appeared on the kitchen table. The scent of baking bread replaced the musty odor of neglect. Curtains, washed and mended, fluttered in the prairie breeze. DeWitt said little, but Tessa noticed small changes in him too. He began lingering over coffee in the mornings, watching her work with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Occasionally, he would answer her careful questions about the ranch or the territory, his responses growing from curt single words to full sentences as the days passed. On her third Sunday at the Diamond P, Tessa was kneading dough when DeWitt appeared in the kitchen doorway, hat in hand. "Church in town," he said abruptly. "Thought you might want to go." Tessa looked up, flour dusting her cheeks. "I didn't know you attended services." "Don't," he admitted, "but figured you might. Being from Boston and all." The consideration behind the offer touched her. "That's kind of you, Mr. Palmer." DeWitt, he said, then looked almost surprised at himself. If we're living under the same roof, might as well use my name. DeWitt, she repeated, testing the sound of it. And I'm Tessa. Something shifted between them in that small exchange, an acknowledgement that they were more than employer and employee, even if neither could define exactly what they were becoming. The ride to church was still quiet, but the silence had lost its earlier hostility. As they approached town, DeWitt cleared his throat. Folks might talk, he warned. Widower with a young woman living at his ranch. Let them, Tessa replied simply. We know the truth of the arrangement. His glance held something like admiration for her pragmatism. The service itself proved more challenging than Tessa had anticipated. The curious stares, the whispered speculations barely concealed behind him books. It all reminded her too painfully of Boston, of the scandal, of the last time she'd sat in a church while an entire congregation judged her. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the hymnal, and she missed the subtle way DeWitt's gaze tracked the reaction, the slight narrowing of his eyes as he noted her discomfort. Afterward, as churchgoers gathered on the steps, Mrs. Abernathy, the banker's wife, approached with a saccharine smile. Miss Kendrick, how interesting to find you living at the Palmer Ranch, she said, her tone making the word interesting sound like an accusation. I do hope your position is well-defined. Before Tessa could respond, DeWitt stepped to her side, his presence solid and unexpectedly protective. Miss Kendrick manages my household with complete professionalism, he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach nearby ears. Her character is beyond reproach. Anyone suggesting otherwise would do well to examine their own Christian charity. The stunned silence that followed was broken only when he offered Tessa his arm. Shall we, Miss Kendrick? I believe we have matters to attend to at home. The gesture was so unexpected that Tessa took his arm automatically, feeling the solid strength of it beneath her fingers as he led her to the wagon. Neither spoke until they were well outside town. Thank you, she said quietly. Small minds and loose tongues, he replied, eyes fixed on the road ahead. I won't have them maligning you for doing honest work. It's not the first time I've faced such speculation, she admitted, then immediately wished she hadn't when his gaze cut to her face. No, there was a question in the single word. Tessa looked away, toward the distant mountains. People find it easy to judge what they don't understand. DeWitt seemed to weigh her words, sensing the deeper current beneath them, but respecting her reluctance to elaborate. True enough, he finally said. When they returned to the ranch, a comfortable routine resumed, but something had shifted. That evening, DeWitt didn't immediately retreat after dinner. Instead, he lingered at the table, watching as Tessa kneaded dough for the next day's bread. My mother used to do that, he said unexpectedly. Same motion, same rhythm. Tessa smiled, not looking up from her work. It's soothing, isn't it? Creating something from such simple ingredients. Never thought of it that way, he admitted. Just knew it meant good bread was coming. There's joy in making things that nourish others, she said, then added more softly. I think that's why I've always loved cooking. Even when everything else feels uncertain, feeding people is a concrete good. DeWitt watched her hands work the dough, her slender fingers strong and sure. You're good at it, he said, bringing life back to things. The simple acknowledgement warmed her more than she cared to admit. Thank you. They fell into silence again, but it was a different kind now, companionable rather than strained. When DeWitt finally rose to leave, he paused at the door. There's a box of Anna's garden seeds in the root cellar, he said, the words coming reluctantly. If you wanted to plant something. She always said May was the time for it. The offer, for it was an offer, Tessa realized, not just information, represented a small but significant breach in the walls he'd built around his grief. Anna's garden had lain fallow since her death, another abandoned piece of the life DeWitt had once planned. I'd like that, Tessa said carefully. If you're certain. He nodded once, unable to meet her eyes, then disappeared into the gathering darkness. The next morning, Tessa found the seed box on the kitchen table, a weathered wooden container with carefully labeled packets inside. The neat handwriting, Anna's, she presumed, detailed planting instructions for each variety. Snapdragons, marigolds, sweet peas, zinnias. When DeWitt came in for breakfast, Tessa was already poring over the contents. The soil's good by the east side of the house, he said, pouring himself coffee. Gets morning sun. I'll start there, then, she replied, looking up to find him watching her with an intensity that sent unexpected warmth through her chest. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the morning-lit kitchen, something unspoken passing between them. Then Joey burst in, breaking the spell with cheerful demands for flapjacks. That afternoon, Tessa began turning the soil in the long-neglected flower beds. The work was hard, the ground baked solid by years of neglect, but there was satisfaction in breaking through the crusty surface to the rich earth beneath. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't notice Dewitt until his shadow fell across the freshly turned soil. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering a canteen of water. Tessa straightened, pushing back a strand of hair with the back of her wrist, leaving a smudge of dirt on her forehead. "Thank you." As she drank, Dewitt studied the flower bed. "You've made good progress. The ground remembers what it's meant to be," she said, returning the canteen. "Sometimes it just needs a little coaxing." His eyes moved from the garden to her face, lingering on the dirt smudge. Without thinking, he reached out, his thumb gently brushing her forehead to remove it. The moment his skin touched hers, something electric passed between them. Tessa's breath caught, and Dewitt froze, his hand suspended in the air between them. For one heartbeat, then two, neither moved. Dewitt's eyes darkened with an emotion Tessa couldn't name, or perhaps feared to. "Mr. Palmer." Joey's voice shattered the moment. "Riders coming in from the south pasture." Dewitt's hand dropped as he turned toward the approaching horseman. "Stay here," he instructed Tessa, his voice suddenly tense. From her position by the flower beds, Tessa watched as three men rode into the yard, their manner casual, but their eyes sharp beneath the brims of their hats. Even from a distance, she could sense Dewitt's wariness as he greeted them. The conversation seemed civil enough, though she couldn't make out the words. One man, taller than the others with a swagger to his posture, did most of the talking. Dewitt's responses were brief, his stance guarded. After some minutes, the men tipped their hats and rode off. Dewitt stood watching them until they disappeared over the ridge before returning to where Tessa waited. "Trouble?" she asked. "Cattlemen's Association representatives," he said, his expression troubled. "Water rights dispute brewing with the Broken Spoke Ranch to the south. Nothing for you to worry about." But there was tension in the set of his shoulders that hadn't been there before. That evening, he was distracted during dinner, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. As Tessa cleared the table, he finally spoke. "I need to ride out tomorrow. Association meeting in Helena. Might be gone 4 days. I'll keep things running here," Tessa assured him. Dewitt nodded, still distracted. "Joey and Bill will be around. Any trouble, send Bill for the marshal in town." "You're expecting trouble?" she asked, setting down the plates she'd been gathering. He met her eyes then, his gaze steady. "Not expecting. Preparing." The Broken Spoke owner, Victor Caldwell, isn't known for taking setbacks gracefully. "This is about more than water rights," Tessa guessed. Dewitt's mouth tightened. "Caldwell wanted this land when I purchased it. Offered to buy me out last year after." He paused. "After Anna. Thought I'd be eager to leave bad memories behind. But you weren't. This land is all I have left of the dream we shared," he said quietly. "I won't be bullied off it." The simple declaration revealed more about Dewitt Palmer than anything he'd said before. His ranch wasn't just property. It was the physical manifestation of hopes he'd once shared with Anna, the only tangible piece of their future that hadn't died with her. "Be careful in Helena," Tessa said softly. Something in her tone made him look at her more carefully. "Always am." That night, as Tessa prepared for bed, she found herself drawn to the window, watching as Dewitt moved between the barn and the house, making preparations for his journey. There was purpose in his stride, a man with clear conviction about the lines he would and wouldn't cross. She thought about the way he'd defended her reputation in town, the gentle way he'd wiped dirt from her forehead. For a man determined to keep the world at arm's length, Dewitt Palmer showed remarkable capacity for kindness. As if sensing her thoughts, he paused and looked up toward her window. Though the distance was too great to see his expression clearly, Tessa felt the weight of his gaze. She raised her hand in a small gesture of acknowledgement. After a moment, he nodded and returned to his tasks. Tessa stepped back from the window, troubled by the growing awareness that Dewitt Palmer was becoming important to her in ways that complicated the careful boundaries of their arrangement. She'd come west to escape scandal, to rebuild her reputation, to start fresh where no one knew her past. Developing feelings for the man who employed her would only create new complications. 3 months, she reminded herself. You agreed to 3 months. But as she slipped into bed, Tessa knew that time was becoming an increasingly irrelevant measure of her commitment to the Diamond P and its solitary owner. DeWitt's absence stretched from the expected 4 days into a week, then 10 days. Tessa maintained the household routine, cooked for the ranch hands, and spent hours tending the newly planted garden, but worry gnawed at her with each passing day. Joey assured her that delays in Helena weren't uncommon. Cattlemen arguing is like watching molasses flow uphill in January, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. On the 11th day, she was hanging laundry when she heard hoofbeats. Her heart leaped, but it was only Bill returning from town. Any word? She called as he dismounted. Telegraph came, he confirmed, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. Said to give it to you direct. Tessa took the telegram with trembling fingers. Meeting extended. Stop trouble with Caldwell faction. Stop returning Thursday. Stop. Palmer. Relief flooded through her, followed by a rush of self-consciousness at the intensity of her reaction. What was happening to her careful plans, her determination to remain detached and professional? That afternoon, as she weeded the flower beds, she found the first green shoots breaking through the soil, tiny promises of the blooms to come. The sight brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Like these seedlings, something new was taking root in her heart, something she hadn't planned for and wasn't sure she was ready to nurture. Thursday dawned bright and clear. Tessa rose early, putting extra care into preparing the house and herself. She chose her blue dress, the one that matched her eyes, though she pretended that wasn't why, and pinned her hair with special attention. Looking mighty fine, Miss Kendrick, Joey remarked when he came in for coffee. Special occasion? Just tired of work clothes, she deflected, though the knowing look in his eyes suggested he wasn't fooled. By mid-afternoon, there was still no sign of DeWitt. Tessa found herself inventing tasks that kept her near windows with a view of the road. When she caught herself rearranging the same shelf for the 3rd time, she forced herself outside to check on her seedlings. The sound of approaching riders finally came as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. Tessa straightened from the garden, shading her eyes against the golden light. 3 riders approached, DeWitt in the lead, flanked by 2 men she didn't recognize. Relief surged through her, but it was short-lived. As they drew closer, she could see that DeWitt rode stiffly, his posture unnatural. When they reached the yard and he dismounted, she gasped at the sight of his face. A dark bruise bloomed across his left cheekbone, and dried blood crusted at the corner of his mouth. DeWitt, she exclaimed, hurrying forward without thought for propriety. What happened? Nothing that won't heal, he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. Miss Kendrick, this is Marshal Reeves and his deputy. The marshal, a weathered man with shrewd eyes, tipped his hat. Ma'am, sorry to arrive unannounced. Mr. Palmer had some trouble in Helena, the deputy added, earning a sharp look from both DeWitt and the marshal. Let's get you inside, Tessa said, noting how DeWitt winced as he moved. I'll put coffee on. In the kitchen, while the marshal and his deputy waited in the yard, Tessa insisted on examining DeWitt's injuries. Despite his protests, she gently cleaned the cut on his lip and applied a cool cloth to the bruise on his face. Caldwell's men? She asked quietly, standing closer to him than propriety strictly allowed. DeWitt's eyes met hers, something unreadable in their depths. Caught me leaving the meeting. 3 of them. Would have been worse if the marshal hadn't happened by. They could have killed you, she whispered, her fingers unconsciously tightening on the cloth she held. Probably just wanted to send a message, DeWitt said, though his tone lacked conviction. Caldwell wants this land badly enough to play dirty. It's not just land to him, is it? Tessa asked, intuition guiding her words. There's something else. DeWitt hesitated, then sighed. There's a survey that suggests a significant silver deposit on the North Ridge. Nothing confirmed, but enough to make Caldwell greedy. And worth assaulting you for, Tessa concluded, anger flaring at the thought of DeWitt attacked by multiple men. I'll be fine, he assured her, his hand suddenly covering hers where it rested against his bruised cheek. It looks worse than it is. For a moment, they remained frozen in that position, his warm hand over hers. their eyes locked in silent communication. Then Joey's voice called from outside, breaking the spell. "Boss, Marshall's asking if you need a doctor fetched from town." Dewitt released her hand reluctantly. "Better go assure them I'm not dying," he said, a hint of wry humor entering his voice for the first time. That night, after the marshal and deputy had departed with promises to increase patrols in the area, Tessa brought Dewitt a plate of food in the parlor, where he'd unexpectedly chosen to sit. She paused in the doorway, struck by the sight of him in the room he'd avoided since her arrival. He sat in an armchair near the cold fireplace, examining a framed photograph. "I can bring this to the kitchen if you prefer," she offered, indicating the tray. "No," he said, setting down the photograph. "I think it's time this room was used again." Tessa entered, setting the tray on a small table beside him. Her eyes fell on the photograph, a wedding portrait, Dewitt standing proud and straight beside a beautiful young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "Anna was lovely," Tessa said softly. "Yes," Dewitt agreed, but his eyes were on Tessa now, not the photograph. "She would have liked you. Probably sent Thomas instructions to find someone exactly like you." The compliment, unexpected and sincere, warmed Tessa to her core. "I wish I could have known her." "So do I," he said simply. Then, with visible effort, he added, "But I'm glad to know you, Tessa Kendrick." She smiled, fighting the urge to touch him again. "Eat your dinner before it gets cold," she instructed gently. "You need to keep up your strength." As she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "Would you stay? Just for a while?" The request contained vulnerability that Dewitt Palmer rarely revealed. Tessa nodded, settling into the chair opposite his. "Tell me about Boston," he said as he began to eat. "What was your life like there?" The question sent a ripple of anxiety through her. How much could she safely reveal? "Conventional," she said carefully. "My father was in banking. We lived in a nice home, attended the right church, participated in the expected social functions." "And yet you left it all to cook for a stranger in Montana territory," Dewitt observed, his eyes sharp despite his injuries. "Quite a change." "Sometimes change is necessary," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "Sometimes the life others expect you to live becomes unbearable." Something in her tone must have conveyed the depth of feeling behind her words, because Dewitt didn't press further. Instead, he nodded as if he understood completely. "I considered selling after Anna died," he admitted. "Thought about heading to California, starting fresh where every hill and creek didn't remind me of her." "What stopped you?" He considered the question, his fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Partly stubbornness. Partly feeling like I'd be abandoning her if I left. But mostly," he set down his fork, "mostly knowing that running from pain just means unpacking it somewhere else." The simple wisdom of his words struck Tessa deeply. Wasn't that exactly what she'd done? Packed up her pain and shame and carried it west, hoping somehow the distance would diminish it? "Does it get easier?" she asked softly. "The pain." Dewitt's eyes held hers, seeing more than she intended to reveal. "Not easier. Different. Less raw. More like an old injury that aches when the weather changes." They sat in companionable silence after that, each lost in private thoughts, yet somehow less alone for sharing the quiet moment. When Tessa finally rose to leave, Dewitt called her name once more. "The garden," he said. "I saw the seedlings coming up. Thank you for that." "They're Anna's flowers," she reminded him gently. "Yes," he agreed. "But you're the one giving them new life." The words followed Tessa to her room, where she sat at her small desk and pulled out her diary. For the first time since arriving at the Diamond P, she wrote not about her daily tasks or the progress of the household, but about the complex emotions stirring within her heart. "I find myself caring for him in ways I never anticipated," she confessed to the page. "His pain, his strength, his quiet dignity, they move me. I came here seeking safety and anonymity, but I found something I wasn't looking for, connection." But there remained the question of her past, the secret that had driven her west. If Dewitt knew the truth about the scandal in Boston, would he look at her with the same respect, the same growing warmth? Or would his eyes fill with the same judgment she'd fled? Tessa closed the diary without answering her own question. Some truths were better left unwritten, at least for now. The following weeks brought a subtle but unmistakable shift in life at the Diamond P. Dewitt's injuries healed, leaving only a faint scar at the corner of his mouth to mark the encounter in Helena. The garden flourished under Tessa's care, the first blooms adding splashes of color against the weathered wood of the house. Most significantly, the invisible barriers between them began to dissolve, replaced by a tentative but growing closeness. Dewitt no longer retreated immediately after meals, but lingered to talk. He began asking Tessa's opinion on ranch matters, valuing her practical perspective. When a late spring storm blew in unexpectedly, he worked alongside her to cover the fragile seedlings, their hands occasionally brushing as they secured tarpaulins against the wind. For Tessa, these small moments of connection were both precious and frightening. Each day brought her closer to the end of her 3-month trial period, and with it, the question of what would come next. Would she stay? Could she stay, with her feelings developing as they were? And always, shadowing these questions, loomed the specter of her secret past. One evening in late May, as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the western sky, Dewitt broke a comfortable silence. "Your 3 months are nearly up," he said, his voice carefully neutral. Tessa's heart quickened. "Yes, next week. Have you given thought to what you'll do next?" She turned to study his profile, trying to read his feelings in the set of his jaw, the careful way he avoided meeting her eyes. "I suppose that depends." "On what?" "On whether my services are still required," she said softly. "On whether I've proven useful." Now he did look at her, his expression intense in the fading light. "You know you have. The ranch hasn't run this smoothly in years." "Then I'd like to stay," she admitted. "If that's what you want." DeWitt's hand moved across the space between their chairs, finding hers in the gathering twilight. His fingers were warm and calloused as they closed around hers. "It's what I want," he said simply. They sat in silence after that, hands joined as darkness settled over the land. Neither spoke of the line they'd just crossed, from employer and employee to something more complex and undefined, but both felt the significance of the moment. Later that night, unable to sleep, Tessa stood at her bedroom window, gazing out at the starlit landscape. The beauty of Montana still took her breath away, the vastness of it, the sense of possibility contained in its wild expanses. For the first time since leaving Boston, she allowed herself to imagine a future here, not just months, but years. A life built on this land, alongside a man whose quiet strength had become essential to her. But the newspaper clipping hidden in her diary whispered warnings. How could she build a future on hidden truths? DeWitt valued honesty above all else. She'd seen it in his business dealings, in his direct way of speaking. If he learned she'd deceived him, even by omission. A movement outside caught her attention. DeWitt stood by the corral, his face tilted up to the same stars she'd been contemplating. As if sensing her gaze, he turned toward the house, toward her window. Even across the distance, she felt the connection between them, like an invisible thread binding them together. He raised his hand in greeting, and she returned the gesture, her decision crystallizing in that silent exchange. Tomorrow, she would tell him everything. Whatever came after would at least be built on truth. Morning brought unexpected complications. As Tessa prepared breakfast, Joey burst into the kitchen, his expression urgent. "Riders coming," he announced. "Lot of them. Caldwell's men, by the look of it." Tessa's hand froze on the coffee pot. "Where's DeWitt?" "North pasture since dawn. Bill's riding to fetch him." Through the window, Tessa could see the approaching horsemen, at least 8 of them, moving with purposeful speed toward the ranch house. Fear coiled in her stomach, but she forced herself to remain calm. "How long until DeWitt returns?" she asked. 20 minutes, maybe more," Joey estimated, checking his pistol. "Not enough time." Whatever Caldwell's men intended, they would arrive long before DeWitt could return to defend his property. "Get to the barn," Tessa instructed, decision made. "Make them think you're preparing to defend the house." "I'll stall them." Joey looked doubtful. "Boss wouldn't want you putting yourself in danger, Miss Kendrick." "I'm not planning to," she assured him, though her racing heart suggested otherwise. "But I've dealt with difficult men before. Sometimes words can buy time where bullets can't." Before Joey could object further, she smoothed her apron, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and walked purposefully onto the porch. The riders were entering the yard now, dust rising from beneath their horses' hooves. At their center rode a tall man with silver-streaked hair and cold eyes. Victor Caldwell, she presumed. "Good morning, gentlemen," she called, her voice steadier than she felt. "Mr. Palmer isn't here at present. but I'd be happy to offer you coffee while you wait." Her calm greeting clearly wasn't what they'd expected. Caldwell reined his horse, studying her with narrowed eyes. "And who might you be?" he demanded. "Tessa Kendrick, Mr. Palmer's housekeeper," she replied, descending the porch steps with deliberate grace. "And you would be Mr. Caldwell, I presume? Dewitt has mentioned your interest in his property." Something dangerous flickered in Caldwell's expression. "Has he now? And what else has Palmer shared with his housekeeper?" The insinuation in his tone was unmistakable, but Tessa refused to be baited. Enough to know that legitimate business is conducted in offices, not by riding onto someone's property with armed men. Caldwell dismounted, handing his reins to one of his companions. "You've got spirit, Miss Kendrick. I admire that. But you're meddling in matters beyond your understanding." "On the contrary," Tessa replied, holding her ground as he approached. "I understand perfectly. You want something that isn't yours, and you're willing to use intimidation to get it." "What I want," Caldwell said, his voice hardening, "is what should have been mine from the start. Palmer knew I had my eye on this parcel when he swooped in and purchased it." "Fair and square, from what I hear," Tessa countered. "You had the same opportunity to make an offer." Caldwell's face darkened. "You're awfully well-informed for hired help. And you're awfully aggressive for a man who claims to be a legitimate businessman," she shot back. For a tense moment, they stared at each other, the air between them charged with unspoken threats. Then, unexpectedly, Caldwell laughed, a sound without humor. "Palmer's a lucky man to have such a fierce defender," he said. "But luck runs out, Miss Kendrick. You might want to consider your position carefully." "Is that a threat, Mr. Caldwell?" "Call it friendly advice," he replied, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Things are going to get uncomfortable around here. When they do, remember you have options. A woman with your qualities would be welcome at the Broken Spoke." The suggestion sent a chill through Tessa, but she maintained her composed expression. "I'm quite content where I am. Thank you." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their standoff. Dewitt and Bill galloped into the yard, pulling up hard when they saw the gathering. Dewitt's face was a thundercloud as he dismounted, striding directly to Tessa's side. "You all right?" he asked her quietly, his eyes never leaving Caldwell. "Fine," she assured him, touched by his concern even in the face of danger. "Caldwell," Dewitt acknowledged, positioning himself slightly in front of Tessa. "This is private property. Just paying a neighborly visit." Caldwell replied with mock civility. "Getting acquainted with your staff. Charming woman. State your business or leave," Dewitt said flatly. Caldwell's pretense of friendliness fell away. "My business is the same as it's always been, Palmer. This land should be part of the Broken Spoke. The association meeting made it clear you don't have the resources or connections to develop it properly." "Not for sale," Dewitt replied. "Not now, not ever. Everything's for sale at the right price," Caldwell countered. "Or under the right pressure." His gaze slid meaningfully to Tessa. "Shame if anything happened to disrupt this cozy arrangement you've got here." Dewitt took a step forward, tension radiating from every line of his body. "Threaten her again, and our next conversation will be considerably less civil." The naked protectiveness in his voice made Tessa's heart turn over. She placed a restraining hand on his arm, feeling the rigid muscle beneath his shirt. Caldwell noted the gesture with calculating eyes. "Interesting. Very interesting." He turned back to his horse. "Think about my offer, Palmer. Money's cleaner than blood." As Caldwell and his men rode away, Dewitt remained rooted in place, his jaw clenched so tightly that Tessa could see a muscle jumping in his cheek. Only when the riders disappeared over the ridge did he turn to face her. "You shouldn't have confronted them alone," he said, his voice rough with barely contained emotion. "Caldwell's dangerous." "Joey was nearby," she defended. "I was just buying time until you returned." "He could have hurt you," Dewitt insisted, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders. "Do you understand that? These men don't play by civilized rules." "Neither do I, when necessary," Tessa replied, meeting his intense gaze steadily. Something in her response made him pause, his expression shifting from anger to curiosity. What does that mean? The moment had come sooner than she'd planned, forced by circumstances rather than chosen in calm reflection. But perhaps that was fitting. Life on the frontier rarely allowed for careful timing. "There's something I need to tell you," she said quietly. "Something about why I really came west." Dewitt's hands fell away from her shoulders, but he didn't step back. I'm listening. Not here, she said, glancing toward where Joey and Bill were watching with undisguised interest. In private, they walked together to the garden she'd planted, now showing promising signs of life. Ironic, Tessa thought, that she might destroy what had grown between them in the very place where new beginnings had taken root. Before I came here, she began, gathering her courage, there was a scandal in Boston. A significant scandal that involved my family. Dewitt remained silent, his expression guarded but not hostile. My father was a banker, she continued. Respected, trusted by many of Boston's elite families. What no one knew, what I didn't know until it was too late, was that he had been embezzling from his clients for years. Understanding dawned in Dewitt's eyes. The money's gone. Every penny, Tessa confirmed. When it was discovered, my father took his own life rather than face the consequences. My mother had died years earlier, so I was left alone to face the public disgrace. The families who lost their savings blamed me, convinced I must have known, must have helped him. Did you? Dewitt asked directly. No, she answered without hesitation. But in their eyes, I was guilty by association. No one would hire me, speak to me, even acknowledge my existence. I became a pariah overnight. So you ran west, Dewitt concluded. Thomas Palmer was one of the few who believed in my innocence, she explained. He offered me a chance to start over somewhere my name wasn't synonymous with dishonesty and theft. Why didn't you tell me this from the beginning? The question contained no accusation, just genuine curiosity, which gave Tessa hope. Would you have welcomed me if you'd known I was the daughter of a disgraced suicide? A woman suspected of helping swindle respected families. Dewitt considered this, his expression thoughtful. Probably not, he admitted. Though not for the reasons you might think. What reasons, then? Out here, a person's word is everything, he said. Their reputation, their handshake, it's how we survive. I might have worried that complications from your past could follow you here. Like Caldwell, Tessa said softly. Like Caldwell, he agreed. Men who would use any leverage against me. The implication hung in the air between them. If Caldwell discovered her past, he would certainly use it against Dewitt, and by extension, against her. I understand if you want me to leave, Tessa said, forcing the words past the tightness in her throat. I've put you in a difficult position by not being forthright. Dewitt was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to the garden she'd planted, then to the ranch house beyond. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but certain. I've spent 3 years hiding from life, he said. Convincing myself that the only safe path was solitude, that letting anyone close again was inviting devastation. His eyes returned to her face. Then you arrived, and slowly, day by day, you brought light back into places I thought would stay dark forever. Tessa's heart hammered against her ribs as he took a step closer. Your father's sins aren't yours, he continued. Out here, we judge people by their actions, not their family's mistakes. And your actions, Tessa Kendrick, have shown me nothing but honesty, courage, and kindness. Even though I kept this from you, she whispered. We all have pasts we'd rather leave behind, he replied. I don't need to know everything you were. I care about who you are now, here, on this land. The weight that had pressed on Tessa's heart for months began to lift. And who am I? She asked, her voice barely audible. Dewitt's hand rose to cup her cheek, his touch infinitely gentle. You're the woman who made me remember how to live again, he said simply. And I'd be a fool to let you go because of ghosts from Boston. Tears blurred Tessa's vision as the full impact of his acceptance washed over her. She had carried her secret for so long, certain that revelation would mean rejection, that his response left her breathless with relief and something deeper, something that felt dangerously like love. Caldwell won't stop, she warned, needing him to understand the full implications of her staying. If he learns about my past, let him come, Dewitt interrupted, a new fierceness in his tone. This land, this life, it's worth fighting for, worth protecting. His thumb brushed away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. You're worth protecting, Tessa. In that moment, with the Montana sky vast above them and the scent of earth and new growth around them, Tessa made her choice. She would not run again. Whatever came next, Caldwell, rumors, the past catching up, she would face it here, on this land, alongside this man who saw her true self and chose her anyway. Then I'll stay, she said, her voice steadying. And whatever Caldwell brings, we'll face it together. DeWitt's smile transformed his face, erasing the last shadows of grief that had clung to him since she'd first arrived. Together, he agreed. His hand slid from her cheek to the nape of her neck, drawing her closer. When his lips met hers, Tessa felt as though something long dormant within her had suddenly bloomed, like the flowers pushing up through the soil she'd tended, reaching for light after years of darkness. The kiss deepened, became a promise, a declaration more powerful than words. When they finally parted, breathless and flushed, DeWitt pressed his forehead to hers. "I never thought I'd find this again," he murmured. "Never thought I'd want to." "Nor I," Tessa admitted. "I came west looking for escape, not connection. And instead, we both found second chances," he said, wonder in his voice. As they walked back toward the house, hands entwined, Tessa knew that the battle with Caldwell was far from over, that her past might still return to haunt them, that the path ahead would not be smooth. But for the first time since her world had collapsed in Boston, she felt truly unafraid. She had come to the Diamond P to cook for a cowboy, to hide from scandal, to simply survive. Instead, she had found her home, her purpose, her heart's true north. Whatever storms gathered on the horizon, they would weather them together. Two souls who had learned that even in the harshest landscapes, love could take root and flourish. The confrontation with Caldwell catalyzed a transformation at the Diamond P. What had been implicit became explicit. Tessa was no longer simply the housekeeper, but DeWitt's partner in every sense but the legal one. The ranch hands observed this shift with quiet approval, especially Joey, who took to calling them the boss and the missus when he thought they couldn't hear. June blossomed into July, the garden flourishing under Tessa's care, mirroring the relationship growing between her and DeWitt. They developed a rhythm together, rising at dawn, sharing coffee on the porch, discussing the day's work. In the evenings, they often sat in the parlor, the room no longer a shrine to grief, but a living space where new memories formed alongside honored old ones. Anna's photograph remained on the mantel, but no longer faced downward. "She would want me to be happy," DeWitt had explained simply when Tessa questioned this change. "Just as I would have wanted her to find joy again if our situations were reversed." The threat from Caldwell receded temporarily as a dispute with Native Americans in the Northern Territory drew the territorial governor's attention, and with it, increased military presence that made aggressive moves against neighboring ranches politically unwise. But DeWitt and Tessa harbored no illusions that this reprieve would last forever. "He's waiting," DeWitt acknowledged one evening as they reviewed the ranch's finances. "Biding his time until attention shifts elsewhere. Then we use this time to prepare," Tessa replied practically, "starting with documenting everything, the survey results, the water rights, every legal claim to this land." "Already done," DeWitt said, admiration evident in his voice. "You'd have made a formidable frontier lawyer, Miss Kendrick." "I prefer my current position," she responded with a smile that made him catch his breath. Their peaceful interlude ended on a sweltering August afternoon. DeWitt and the hands were moving cattle to higher pasture when a rider approached the ranch house at a gallop. From the kitchen window, Tessa recognized Marshal Reeves, his normally composed demeanor replaced by urgent haste. She met him on the porch, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. "Marshal? What's happened?" "Miss Kendrick," he greeted, removing his hat. "Is Palmer here?" "Out with the herd," she replied, anxiety building at his expression. "Expected back by sundown." Reeves hesitated. "Perhaps I should wait for his return." "Whatever you've come to say, you can say to me," Tessa stated firmly. "DeWitt and I have no secrets." Something in her tone must have convinced him, for he nodded grimly. "A telegram came from Boston," he said, producing a folded paper. "Addressed to me, regarding you. Someone named Harrison Blackwell inquiring about your whereabouts." The name sent ice through Tessa's veins. Harrison Blackwell had been one of her father's largest investors, and most vocal accusers after the fraud was discovered. "What does he want?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Claims you absconded with evidence related to your father's financial dealings," Reeves said, watching her reaction carefully. "Says you're wanted for questioning in connection with the embezzlement." "That's a lie," Tessa said flatly. "I knew nothing of my father's crimes, and I took nothing when I left Boston except my personal belongings." "I figured as much," Reeves replied, surprising her. Man doesn't wait over a year to report stolen evidence if it's actually important. This smells like personal vendetta. Relief washed through Tessa. Thank you for believing me. Don't thank me yet, Reeves cautioned. There's more. Blackwell's hired a Pinkerton detective. Man arrived in Helena yesterday, asking questions about new arrivals from the east. How did Blackwell find me? Tessa wondered aloud, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Can't say for certain, Reeves responded. But there was a curious coincidence. Telegram arrived the day after Victor Caldwell returned from a business trip to St. Louis. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Caldwell must have connections in Boston. When he couldn't intimidate Dewitt directly, he went looking for leverage. That would be my assessment, Reeves agreed. Caldwell's clever. Using an old scandal to pressure Palmer indirectly is just his style. No direct connection to him if things get messy. What do I do? Tessa asked, forcing back the panic threatening to overwhelm her. First, you tell Palmer everything, Reeves advised. No surprises when the Pinkerton shows up. Second, gather any documentation that proves your innocence. Letters, bank records, anything that shows you weren't involved in your father's dealings. I have some correspondence from Thomas Palmer, Tessa said, thinking quickly, and my diary entries from when the scandal broke. Not much else. It's a start, Reeves said encouragingly. Third, and this is important, Miss Kendrick, don't run. Running looks like guilt, and it's exactly what Caldwell wants. The advice struck Tessa with particular force. Running had been her instinct for so long. Flee the shame, the accusations, the hostile stares. But Reeves was right. If she disappeared now, it would only confirm the false narrative Caldwell was constructing. I won't run, she promised, straightening her shoulders. This is my home now. I'll defend it. Reeves smiled slightly. Palmer's a lucky man, he observed. Not many women would stand their ground against the likes of Caldwell and a Pinkerton detective. Not many women have as much to fight for. Tessa replied simply. After Reeves departed with promises to delay the Pinkertons' investigation as much as legally possible, Tessa retreated to her room. She retrieved her diary from beneath the mattress, along with the newspaper clipping that had haunted her for so long. Rereading the article now, she was struck by how carefully it avoided direct accusations while implying her complicity through strategic phrasing. The sound of horses in the yard alerted her to Dewitt's return. Taking a deep breath, she gathered the diary and clipping and went to meet him, preparing herself to face yet another revelation that could threaten their fragile happiness. Dewitt knew something was wrong the moment he saw her expression. What happened? He asked, dismounting quickly. Caldwell, she replied, leading him to the privacy of the parlor. He found my past and sent it after me. As she explained the marshal's visit, the Pinkerton detective, and Blackwell's accusations, Dewitt's expression darkened, but not with doubt, with protective anger. I'll kill him, he said simply when she finished. Caldwell. For starters, Dewitt confirmed, pacing the parlor like a caged wolf. Using your past this way, it's despicable. But effective, Tessa pointed out pragmatically. He knows that even unfounded accusations can destroy a reputation out here. If word spreads that I'm a fugitive from justice, you're not, Dewitt interrupted fiercely. The truth may not matter, she continued gently. Perception becomes reality, especially in small communities. People will begin to question whether you're harboring a criminal. It could affect your standing with the Cattlemen's Association, your ability to do business in town. I don't care, Dewitt insisted, kneeling before her chair and taking her hands in his. Let them talk. Let them whisper. This land is ours, and no amount of gossip will change that. The possessive plurality of ours wasn't lost on Tessa. Despite everything, Dewitt was declaring his commitment to her, to their shared future. There's another option, she said hesitantly. I could go to Helena, meet with this Pinkerton detective, explain my side directly. If I can convince him there's no case against me. Absolutely not, Dewitt cut in. Going alone would be walking into Caldwell's trap. Then come with me, she suggested. We'll face this together, on our terms, not theirs. Dewitt considered this, his thumb absently stroking the back of her hand as he thought. It's risky, he acknowledged, but less risky than waiting for them to come here with false accusations when we're unprepared. Decision made. They spent the evening gathering evidence of Tessa's innocence. Thomas Palmer's letters vouching for her character, her diary entries documenting her shock at discovering her father's crimes, the official notice of her father's death that proved she had remained in Boston for weeks after the scandal broke, hardly the action of someone fleeing justice. The next morning, after giving instructions to Joey about managing the ranch in their absence, they set out for Helena. The journey took 2 days, during which Tessa alternated between confident determination and gnawing anxiety. "What if they don't believe me?" she asked as they made camp on the first night. "What if Blackwell's influence reaches even here?" Dewitt built up the fire before answering. "Then we keep fighting," he said simply. "Together." He sat beside her on the bedroll, his solid presence calming her frayed nerves. "I've been thinking," he said after a comfortable silence had settled between them, "about what happens after this is resolved." "You're confident it will be?" Tessa observed. "I have to be," he replied with a faint smile. "Hope's all that separates men from beasts out here sometimes." She leaned against his shoulder, drawing strength from his steadiness. "And what happens after, in this hopeful future of yours?" DeWitt's arm encircled her, drawing her closer. "I think it's time to make certain arrangements official," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "If you're amenable." Tessa's heart skipped a beat. "What sort of arrangements?" "The sort that involve a preacher, a ring, and promises meant to last a lifetime," he answered, turning to face her directly. "I'm not doing this properly. There should be flowers, a practiced speech." "This is perfect," Tessa interrupted, her eyes shining in the firelight. "Just as it is." "Then marry me," DeWitt said simply. "Not because of Caldwell or Pinkerton detectives or the need to protect your reputation. Marry me because I love you, and because I want to build a life with you on land that belongs to both of us." The declaration, for it was a declaration more than a question, left Tessa momentarily speechless. Despite the growing closeness between them, despite the kisses and tender moments, neither had spoken the word love aloud until now. "Yes," she finally whispered, her voice breaking on the single syllable. "Yes, I'll marry you, Dewitt Palmer." His kiss was fierce and tender all at once, sealing their commitment under the vast Montana sky. When they finally parted, breathless and flushed, DeWitt pressed his forehead to hers. "Whatever happens in Helena," he vowed, "we face it as future husband and wife. No one can separate us now." They arrived in Helena the following afternoon and made their way directly to the marshal's office. Reeves greeted them with visible relief. "Good timing," he said. "Pinkerton's been asking about you. Man named Hollister. Been staying at the Grand Hotel, making a nuisance of himself." "We'll go to him," DeWitt decided. "Better to control the meeting on our terms." The Grand Hotel stood at the center of Helena, its facade imposing against the frontier town's more modest structures. Tessa smoothed her travel-wrinkled dress as they entered the lobby, conscious of the stares they attracted. DeWitt with his rancher's weathered face and confident stride, she with her Eastern manner that hadn't entirely faded despite months on the frontier. They found James Hollister in the hotel restaurant, a lean man with observant eyes and a meticulously trimmed mustache. He showed no surprise at their arrival, suggesting he'd anticipated their move. "Miss Kendrick," he acknowledged, rising politely. "Mr. Palmer, I've been expecting you." "Have you?" DeWitt responded, his hand protective at the small of Tessa's back. "Marshal Reeves isn't exactly subtle," Hollister said with a thin smile. "Please, join me." As they sat, Tessa studied the detective carefully. He didn't have the predatory look she'd feared. Rather, he seemed weary, his eyes reflecting a man who had seen too much deception to be easily impressed by either guilt or innocence. "Mr. Blackwell has made serious allegations," Hollister began without preamble. "He claims you took financial records that would prove your complicity in your father's schemes." "I took nothing except my personal belongings," Tessa replied steadily. "And I knew nothing of my father's crimes until they were publicly revealed." "So you say," Hollister remarked, his tone neither believing nor disbelieving. "Yet you fled Boston rather precipitously." "I left Boston because I had nothing left there," Tessa corrected. "My father was dead, my family name ruined, and former friends had become accusers. Thomas Palmer offered me a position and a chance at a new beginning." "Convenient," Hollister observed. "Truth often is," DeWitt interjected, his patience clearly wearing thin. Hollister's gaze shifted to him, assessing. "You're engaged to marry Miss Kendrick, I understand. Does it not concern you that your future wife might be implicated in financial fraud?" "Not in the slightest," DeWitt replied without hesitation. Because I know her character, which is more than I can say for Harrison Blackwell or whoever hired you to harass an innocent woman. A flicker of something, respect, perhaps, crossed Hollister's features. Strong words, Mr. Palmer. Backed by stronger feelings, DeWitt assured him. Now, we've come prepared to address these false allegations directly. After that, I expect you to leave Miss Kendrick in peace. Tessa produced the documents they'd gathered, explaining each one's significance as Hollister examined them with professional detachment. To her surprise, the detective listened attentively, asking clarifying questions that suggested genuine interest in understanding the full picture. These diary entries, he said finally, tapping the pages Tessa had shared. They're quite detailed regarding your shock at discovering your father's actions. I wrote them as events unfolded, Tessa explained. I couldn't comprehend how the father I thought I knew could have betrayed so many people's trust, including yours, Hollister noted, watching her carefully. Especially mine, she agreed, meeting his gaze directly. He raised me to believe that integrity was everything, Mr. Hollister. Learning that he had lived a lie, it destroyed my world long before the public scandal did. Something in her sincerity seemed to reach the detective. He sat back, tapping his fingers thoughtfully on the table. Mr. Blackwell is a powerful man with powerful friends, he said after a long moment. But the Pinkerton Agency values its reputation for finding truth, not simply serving wealth. These documents, combined with certain inconsistencies in Mr. Blackwell's statements, lead me to believe his accusations against you are, at minimum, greatly exaggerated. Relief flooded through Tessa, but she maintained her composure. And at maximum? At maximum, Hollister said carefully. They represent a deliberate attempt to manipulate the justice system for personal vengeance. Or financial gain, DeWitt added meaningfully. Given Caldwell's involvement. Hollister's eyebrow rose. Victor Caldwell? Interesting. Mr. Blackwell didn't mention that connection. I'm sure he didn't, DeWitt replied dryly. Just as I'm sure it's pure coincidence that these accusations surfaced right when Caldwell is trying to pressure me to sell my ranch. The detective's expression suggested this information was fitting pieces into place. I dislike being used as a pawn in property disputes, he remarked, gathering the documents and returning them to Tessa. It reflects poorly on the agency. Then you're dropping the investigation? Tessa asked, hardly daring to hope. I am submitting my report that no evidence exists to support Mr. Blackwell's allegations, Hollister clarified. What happens after that is beyond my control, but my professional assessment carries considerable weight. Thank you, Tessa said sincerely. Hollister's professional demeanor softened slightly. Don't thank me for doing my job, Miss Kendrick. Though I will offer congratulations on your engagement. Montana seems to agree with you far better than Boston did. As they left the hotel, Tessa felt lighter than she had in months, perhaps years. The specter of her father's crimes that had followed her across the continent seemed finally to be fading, allowing her to see a future unencumbered by past shadows. He believed me, she marveled as they walked arm in arm along Helena's bustling main street. I never thought a Pinkerton detective would take my word over Blackwell's. He believed the evidence, DeWitt corrected gently, and probably saw through Caldwell's scheme. Pinkertons aren't easily manipulated. What do you think Caldwell will do next? She asked, the temporary euphoria giving way to practical concerns. DeWitt's expression hardened. Something desperate, I expect. Men like him don't admit defeat easily. His prediction proved prescient sooner than either anticipated. As they prepared to leave Helena the next morning, a telegram arrived from Joey. Fire at North Pasture stop. Caldwell men seen nearby stop all safe, but damage extensive stop returns soonest stop. DeWitt crushed the paper in his fist, rage etched in every line of his face. He's escalating, he said, his voice dangerously controlled. First threats, then your past, now direct sabotage. We need to get back, Tessa urged, already gathering their belongings. Before he does worse. The return journey passed in tense silence, both lost in contemplation of what awaited them. When they crested the final ridge overlooking the Diamond P, Tessa gasped at the sight. The North Pasture was a blackened scar against the green landscape, the charred remains of fence posts marking where boundaries had stood. Joey met them in the yard, his normally cheerful face grim. Started in the night, he reported. Wind drove it fast. We managed to contain it before it reached the house or barn, but the north grazing land is gone. Cattle? DeWitt asked tersely. Lost 8 head that we've found so far, Joey answered. Could be more scattered in the hills. DeWitt dismounted, his movements controlled but radiating fury. And Caldwell's men? Bill saw them riding away just as the flames took hold, Joey confirmed. Too dark to identify individuals, but they came from the direction of the broken spoke. Tessa watched as DeWitt surveyed the damage, his jaw clenched so tightly she feared for his teeth. When he finally turned back to her, his expression had shifted from rage to resolute determination. This ends now, he stated, his voice carrying quiet authority. Caldwell wants a war, but I'm going to give him a choice instead. What kind of choice? Tessa asked, anxiety churning in her stomach. The kind that appeals to his greed more than his pride, DeWitt replied. Joey, ride to town. Bring back Marshal Reeves and Judge Harmon if he's available. Tell them it's urgent. As Joey galloped off, DeWitt led Tessa into the house. Despite the crisis unfolding around them, he moved with a curious calmness, as if pieces of a complex puzzle were finally falling into place in his mind. You have a plan, Tessa observed as he spread land surveys across the kitchen table. More than a plan, he replied, tracing his finger along property lines. A solution, one that gives Caldwell what he really wants while protecting what matters most to us. He explained his thinking as they waited for the marshal's arrival. The North Ridge, where the rumored silver deposit lay, was technically part of the Diamond P, but separate from the main ranch. The parcel could be legally divided and sold without affecting the core property. If the silver's real, Caldwell gets rich, DeWitt explained. If it's not, he gets the satisfaction of thinking he's won something from me. Either way, the harassment stops, and we keep our home. Tessa studied the maps, considering the strategy. You'd be giving up a potential fortune, she pointed out. I'd be securing peace, he corrected, and protecting what can't be replaced. His hand covered hers. Money comes and goes, Tessa. Land can be bought and sold. But what we're building here, that's beyond price. The arrival of Marshal Reeves and Judge Harmon interrupted further discussion. Both men were grimly serious when they viewed the fire damage, and attentive as DeWitt outlined his proposal. It could work, Judge Harmon acknowledged, stroking his beard thoughtfully. A formal property division with clear stipulations against further aggression. I can draw up the legal framework today. Caldwell will be suspicious, Reeves warned. He'll think it's a trap. Which is why I need you both as witnesses, DeWitt explained. And why I want this done immediately, before he can plan his next move. By nightfall, the documents were prepared. At dawn, DeWitt, Tessa, Reeves, and Judge Harmon rode to the Broken Spoke, an imposing ranch house built with old money and new ambition. Victor Caldwell received them in his study, surprise poorly concealed beneath affected hospitality. Palmer, he greeted, pointedly ignoring Tessa. Quite the delegation you've brought. Come to lodge formal complaints about a fire I know nothing about. I've come to make a business proposition, DeWitt replied evenly, nodding to Judge Harmon to present the documents. Caldwell's surprise turned genuine as he reviewed the offer. Legal title to the North Ridge parcel in exchange for a binding non-aggression pact and public retraction of any claims against Tessa Kendrick. Why would you surrender the most valuable part of your property? Caldwell asked suspiciously. What game are you playing, Palmer? No game, DeWitt answered. Simple priorities. The Diamond P was never about silver or getting rich quick. It was about building something lasting, something that could be passed down through generations. His gaze shifted briefly to Tessa, and in that glance, Caldwell read everything he needed to know about DeWitt Palmer's motivations. Ah, the older rancher said, something like grudging respect entering his voice. The lady has civilized the cowboy. How conventional. Do we have an agreement? DeWitt pressed, ignoring the jab. Caldwell studied the documents again, calculation evident in his sharp eyes. These terms are surprisingly generous. I assume the marshal and judge are here to ensure I understand there will be no further misunderstandings? The law has a long memory, Caldwell, Reeves confirmed. This agreement ends all hostilities, including proxy attacks through Boston connections. A flicker of annoyance crossed Caldwell's face at having this particular manipulation exposed, but he recovered quickly. Miss Kendrick's past holds no interest for me, he declared with calculated indifference. My concern was always the land. Then we understand each other, Dewitt said. With theatrical flourish, Caldwell signed the documents, then extended his hand across the desk. To business concluded satisfactorily, he offered. Dewitt hesitated only briefly before accepting the handshake. To peace between neighbors, he countered, his grip perhaps firmer than strictly necessary. As they rode away from the broken spoke, Tessa couldn't quite believe the simplicity of the resolution. Will he honor it? She asked the marshal. He's many things, but Caldwell's not stupid, Reeves replied. Breaking a contract witnessed by a territorial judge and marshal would bring down more trouble than even he wants to handle. Besides, he got what he really wanted, a chance at that silver. And if there is no silver? She pressed. Then he paid a fair price for a lesson in humility. Judge Harmon interjected with a rare smile. Either way, you and Palmer come out ahead. Dewitt rode beside her, his expression more peaceful than she'd seen since the confrontation began. It was never about the silver, he said quietly. Some things matter more than mineral rights. The look he gave her conveyed everything words could not. That she was the treasure he valued, that their future together outweighed any potential fortune hidden in the hills. 2 weeks later, on a perfect September morning, Tessa Kendrick became Tessa Palmer in a simple ceremony on the ranch porch. Marshal Reeves stood as witness, Joey served as best man, and the Diamond P hands formed a small but appreciative audience. Even Bill, a man of famously few words, wiped away a suspicious moisture from his eye as Dewitt and Tessa exchanged vows beneath an arch of fresh-cut flowers from the garden she had planted. I take you as my wife, Dewitt promised, his voice steady and sure. To build with, to grow with, to face whatever comes, good seasons and bad, rich years and lean. Together, always together. I take you as my husband, Tessa responded, her heart so full she could barely speak the words. My partner, my home, my second chance at happiness I never thought to find. The kiss that sealed their vows was both tender and passionate, a promise of the life they would create together, the family they would build on this land that had witnessed both their deepest sorrows and most profound joys. That evening, as they stood on the porch of what was now truly their home, Dewitt wrapped his arms around Tessa from behind, both gazing out at the land stretching before them. Any regrets? He asked softly. About leaving Boston, coming west, marrying a stubborn rancher? Tessa leaned back against his solid warmth, her hands covering his where they rested on her waist. Not one, she replied honestly. This is where I belong, where we belong. In the distance, the North Ridge caught the last rays of the setting sun, glowing golden against the darkening sky. Whether it contained silver or not no longer mattered. The true wealth of the Diamond P couldn't be measured in minerals or acres, but in the love that had transformed a house of memories into a home of possibilities. Tessa turned in Dewitt's arms, raising her hand to trace the faint scar at the corner of his mouth, a permanent reminder of the battles they'd fought to reach this moment. I came here to cook for a cowboy, she said softly. I never imagined I'd find my heart's home. And I never imagined I'd open my door to a Boston lady and find the courage to live again, Dewitt responded, his eyes reflecting all the love he'd once believed himself incapable of feeling. As night settled over the Montana frontier, the lights of the Diamond P Ranch house glowed warm and welcoming against the vast darkness. Inside, a man who had once embraced loneliness as the price of survival and a woman who had fled scandal seeking anonymity discovered the greatest truth of the frontier, that sometimes the most valuable treasures aren't found in silver mines or cattle herds, but in the second chances that arrive unexpectedly, changing everything. Sometimes they're found in the courage to begin again, together.